The sound of gunshots echoed through the Montana territory as Naomi Richardson spurred her horse faster through the dense pine forest, her heart pounding with each thundering hoof beat against the rocky terrain. The year was 1876, and at 22, she had never imagined she would be fleeing for her life from a band of outlaws who had attacked her family's stagecoach just miles outside of Whitetail Creek. "Come on, Starlight," she urged her pale gray mare as branches whipped past her face, leaving thin scratches across her cheeks. Her once pristine blue riding dress was torn and mud spattered, her long auburn hair falling loose from its pins as she leaned low over the horse's neck. The saddlebag containing her family's money and valuables bounced against her thigh, all that remained of their journey west. The outlaws' voices grew distant behind her, but Naomi knew she couldn't slow down, not after what they'd done to her father and the stagecoach driver. Tears blurred her vision as she pushed onward, having no idea where she was heading except away from the violence, away from the horrible memories now seared into her mind. The forest began to thin, and the thundering sound of rushing water reached her ears. Starlight's breathing had grown labored, foam flecking the mare's mouth as Naomi guided her toward what she hoped would be the Silver Fork River. If she could cross it, she might have a chance of reaching the nearest settlement before the outlaws caught up. As the trees parted, she gasped at the sight before her. The river wasn't the gentle crossing she had hoped for, but a raging torrent swollen by spring meltwater, white rapids churning violently between steep rocky banks. Naomi pulled back on the reins, trying to halt Starlight's momentum, but the exhausted horse stumbled on the uneven ground. "Whoa, girl! Whoa!" Naomi cried out, but it was too late. Starlight's front hoof caught in a hidden rabbit hole, sending the mare pitching forward with a terrified whinny. Naomi felt herself being thrown from the saddle, her body airborne for one terrifying moment before she plunged toward the roaring water below. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs as the current immediately seized her. Her heavy skirts dragged her downward, the weight of them like an anchor as she fought to keep her head above water. The rapids tossed her mercilessly, slamming her against partially submerged rocks and spinning her until she lost all sense of direction. "Help!" she screamed whenever her head broke the surface, but her voice was lost in the river's roar. Her strength was fading fast, her limbs growing numb from the frigid water as she was swept downstream. In what she was certain would be her final moments, Naomi thought of her mother waiting for them in Oregon, who would now lose both husband and daughter. Through water-blurred vision, she suddenly spotted movement on the riverbank, a rider on horseback galloping parallel to the river. Hope surged within her, giving her one last burst of strength to fight the current and raise her arm. "Here!" she managed to cry out before being dragged under again. The powerful current pushed her toward a bend in the river where the water rushed even faster. As she surfaced again, gasping and coughing, she saw the rider had disappeared from the bank above. Had she imagined him? Was this the delirium of drowning? Then she heard hoofbeats on the gravel riverbank just ahead and a man's voice calling out. Through the spray of water, she saw him, a tall figure on horseback, who had ridden down a dangerous slope to reach the lower bank where the river narrowed. He was leaning dangerously far from his saddle, arm extended toward the water as his horse struggled to maintain footing on the slick stones. "Reach for me," he shouted as Naomi was swept toward him. Now, with the last of her strength, Naomi thrust her arm upward as the current carried her past. For one horrible moment, she thought she would miss, but then she felt the stunning grip of warm, strong fingers closing around her wrist. The jolt nearly pulled her rescuer from his saddle, but he held fast, his arm like iron as he fought against the river's pull. "I've got you," he grunted, his face contorted with effort as he began to pull her from the water. The current fought to keep her, but the stranger's grip never faltered. With agonizing slowness, he dragged her toward the bank, his horse backing up carefully under his guidance. As her body emerged from the water, Naomi felt her consciousness begin to fade, the edges of her vision darkening. The last thing she saw before blackness claimed her was the face of her rescuer, a strong jawline darkened with stubble, intense eyes the color of the Montana sky, and a concerned frown beneath the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat. When Naomi awoke, it was to the crackling sound of a campfire and the smell of coffee brewing. She lay wrapped in several wool blankets, her soaked clothing having been replaced with an oversized flannel shirt and trousers held up by suspenders that had been cinched as tight as possible around her waist. For a moment, panic seized her at the realization that someone had changed her clothes, but a quick assessment told her that her undergarments remained in place, though damp. "You're awake," came a deep voice from nearby. Was starting to worry. Naomi turned her head to find the man from the river sitting on a log beside the fire, stirring something in a cast iron pot. In the firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a face that might have been considered handsome if not for the scar that ran along his right cheekbone. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse from swallowing river water. "How long was I unconscious?" "Few hours," he replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "We're about 5 miles downstream from where I pulled you out. Had to get us to shelter before nightfall." He nodded toward a small lean-to he'd constructed from pine branches. "Name's Mason Daniels, by the way. Most folks call me Mace." "Naomi Richardson," she replied, slowly pushing herself into a sitting position. Her muscles screamed in protest, bruises making themselves known all over her body. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Daniels." He handed her the cup of coffee, their fingers brushing briefly. "What in tarnation were you doing trying to ford the Silver Fork during the spring melt? That river's killed more folks than I care to count." The memory of the attack came rushing back, bringing with it a fresh wave of grief. "Outlaws," she said simply, her hands trembling around the warm cup. "They attacked our stagecoach, killed my father and the driver. I managed to get to my horse and escape, but they were following me. I didn't mean to cross the river. Starlight stumbled at the bank and we both fell." Mason's expression darkened. "The Blackwell gang, I'd wager. They've been terrorizing this territory for months now." He paused, compassion softening his features. "I'm sorry about your father, Miss Richardson." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, but she forced them back. "He was taking me to Oregon. My mother's there already with my uncle setting up our new life." Her voice broke on the last word. "Well, you're safe for now," Mason said, turning his attention back to the pot on the fire. "Hope you're hungry. It's just beans and bacon, but it's hot. My horse." Naomi asked suddenly, remembering poor Starlight's terrified whinny as she fell. Mason shook his head. "No sign of her. River probably took her downstream if she survived the fall. My horse Brutus is all we've got now." As if hearing his name, a large buckskin gelding raised his head from where he was tethered nearby, snorting softly. "Where were you headed before all this happened?" Naomi asked, accepting a plate of the simple but hearty food. "Whitetail Creek," Mason replied, settling back with his own plate. "I'm delivering some letters and supplies. I ride for the Postal Service unofficial capacity. The territories don't get regular mail service yet, so folks like me fill the gaps." Naomi nodded, studying him more carefully. Despite his rough exterior, there was a gentleness to the way he moved, a carefulness in how he spoke. Not the typical coarse cowboy she'd encountered on their journey west. "Once you're feeling stronger," Mason continued, "I'll take you to Whitetail Creek. The sheriff there can help get word to your mother in Oregon." "And then what?" Naomi asked quietly, the full weight of her situation sinking in. "I have nothing but the clothes you've lent me. The outlaws will have taken everything from the stagecoach by now." Mason looked uncomfortable, as if the emotional territory was more treacherous than the wilderness around them. "One step at a time, Miss Richardson. We'll get you to town first." They ate in silence after that, the crackling fire and distant howl of coyotes the only sounds disturbing the Montana night. Despite her exhaustion, Naomi found herself unable to fall asleep right away, too aware of the stranger sleeping just a few feet away from her. But eventually, the day's trauma caught up with her, and she drifted into a fitful slumber filled with dreams of rushing water and her father's voice calling out to her. Morning dawned clear and cool, the scent of pine heavy in the air as Naomi opened her eyes. She found Mason already awake, packing their meager supplies onto Brutus's saddle. "How are you feeling?" he asked when he noticed her watching him. Naomi took mental inventory of her body, wincing as she sat up. "Like I've been dragged behind a wagon for 10 miles, but I'll live thanks to you." A hint of a smile touched Mason's lips, transforming his face and revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "We should get moving. It's a day's ride to Whitetail Creek, and I don't want to be in these woods after dark, especially with the Blackwell gang around." The mention of the outlaws sent a chill down Naomi's spine. "Do you think they're still looking for me?" "Hard to say," Mason replied, checking Brutus's cinch. "But no sense taking chances." Riding double on Brutus proved to be an exercise in awkward proximity. Mason insisted Naomi sit in front where he could keep her secure, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins. The intimacy of the position would have scandalized her mother, but under the circumstances, propriety seemed the least of Naomi's concerns. As they rode through the dense forest, following game trails and occasionally crossing shallow streams, Naomi learned more about her rescuer. Mason had been born in Pennsylvania, but had headed west after the Civil War, seeking opportunities away from the devastation that had claimed his family's farm and both of his older brothers. "Been riding the mail routes for 3 years now," he told her as they stopped to rest Brutus at midday. "It's a good life for a man who doesn't mind his own company." "It sounds lonely," Naomi observed, watching as he checked Brutus's hooves for stones. Mason shrugged. "Lonely's safer than the alternative in my experience." There was a story there Naomi could tell, but she didn't press. Everyone who came west carried their burdens, their secrets. Her father had taught her that much. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain began to change, the forest giving way to rolling foothills covered in tall grass and wildflowers. Naomi's body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she didn't complain. Every mile put distance between them and the outlaws, bringing her closer to safety. "We should reach the outskirts of Whitetail Creek by sunset," Mason said as they crested a hill that afforded them a view of the vast landscape ahead. "There's a creek about a mile ahead where we can," he broke off suddenly, his body tensing behind her. Following his gaze, Naomi spotted what had alarmed him: dust rising from a group of riders moving quickly across the plain below, heading in their direction. "Is it them?" she whispered, fear clutching at her heart. "Can't tell," Mason replied, already turning Brutus off the trail and toward a dense copse of trees to their right. "But we're not waiting to find out." They rode hard for the shelter of the trees, Brutus responding gallantly to the demands placed upon him despite having carried double all day. Once among the trees, Mason dismounted quickly, helping Naomi down before leading Brutus deeper into the woods where they wouldn't be visible from the trail. "Stay here," he instructed, tying Brutus's reins to a low branch. "I'm going to get a better look." Before Naomi could protest, he had slipped away through the underbrush, moving with a silent grace that belied his size. Left alone with the horse, Naomi fought to control her breathing, straining her ears for any sound of approaching riders. Long minutes passed before Mason returned, his expression grim. "It's them," he confirmed. "4 men heavily armed. They're following our trail." Naomi's legs nearly gave out beneath her. "What do we do?" Mason was already untying Brutus. "We run. There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles east of here. If we can reach it, we might be able to hold them off. And if we can't," his eyes met hers, steady and resolute, "then I'll make sure you get away while I deal with them." "I won't leave you to face them alone," Naomi protested. "This isn't up for debate, Miss Richardson," Mason said firmly, lifting her onto Brutus's back before swinging up behind her. "I'm not losing another person I've sworn to protect." Before she could question his words, they were moving again, Brutus navigating the dense woods with remarkable agility as Mason guided him with subtle shifts of weight and quiet commands. They rode hard, branches whipping past them, the sound of their passage seeming impossibly loud to Naomi's frightened ears. When they finally broke through the trees into a small clearing, the trapper's cabin stood before them, a crude structure of rough-hewn logs with a sagging roof and a single small window beside the door. It wasn't much, but the thick walls would provide more protection than the open terrain. Mason dismounted quickly, helping Naomi down before leading Brutus around to the back of the cabin. "There's a lean-to back here where he'll be out of sight," he explained. "You get inside while I secure him." The interior of the cabin was dusty and sparse, a single room with a stone fireplace, a crude table with 1 chair, and a narrow bed frame covered in moldy straw. Naomi wrinkled her nose at the musty smell but was grateful for the solid walls between her and the approaching danger. Mason entered moments later, barring the door behind him before moving to the window. "They'll have followed our tracks," he said grimly, removing a revolver from his belt and checking its chambers. "We need to be ready when they get here." "I can shoot," Naomi told him, squaring her shoulders. "My father taught me." Mason glanced at her with newfound respect, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a second, smaller revolver. 6 shots, he told her as he handed it over. "Make them count." They took up positions on either side of the window, watching the tree line for any sign of the outlaws. The minutes dragged on, tension building in the small cabin until Naomi could hardly breathe from it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, needing to break the silence. "Risking your life for a stranger." Mason kept his eyes on the trees as he answered. "My sister was traveling west 3 years ago. Her stagecoach was attacked by outlaws. No one stopped to help her." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Naomi could sense the pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I swore I'd never ride past someone in trouble again," he continued. "No matter the cost." Before Naomi could respond, movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. "Mason," she hissed, nodding toward the trees. A rider emerged from the forest, then another, their faces hard and weather-beaten beneath wide-brimmed hats. They approached slowly, warily, rifles held ready across their saddles. "That's far enough," Mason called out when they were halfway across the clearing. "This cabin's occupied and we're armed." The men halted, exchanging glances before the leader spoke. "We're looking for a girl," he shouted back. "Red hair, blue dress, stole something valuable from us." "Haven't seen anyone like that," Mason replied. Now turn around and ride away while you still can." The outlaws laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down Naomi's spine. "There are 4 of us and only one of you, mister," the leader called. "Don't be a fool. Give us the girl and whatever's in those saddlebags and you might live through this." "I count 2 of you," Mason replied calmly. "And neither of you is walking away if you take 1 step closer to this cabin." Naomi's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the standoff, her finger trembling slightly on the trigger of the revolver. Where were the other 2 outlaws Mason had seen earlier? The answer came a moment later with the sound of breaking glass as the cabin's single window shattered. Mason spun around just as a shot rang out from the back of the cabin, the bullet splintering the wood of the doorframe inches from his head. "Get down!" he shouted to Naomi, returning fire through the broken window. Outside, chaos erupted. The 2 outlaws in the clearing charged toward the cabin, firing as they came. Mason's shot caught one in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his saddle with a cry of pain. The other dismounted behind his fallen horse, using the animal as cover as he continued firing. Inside, Naomi and Mason pressed themselves against the walls on either side of the window, taking turns leaning out to fire at their attackers. The sound was deafening in the small space, the air quickly filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder. "The back door," Mason shouted over the din. "Watch it!" No sooner had he spoken than the rear door splintered under a heavy blow. Naomi spun around, raising her revolver as a bearded outlaw burst into the cabin. Her shot went wide, hitting the wall behind him as he lunged toward her. Mason was there in an instant, tackling the man before he could reach Naomi. They crashed into the table, sending it toppling as they grappled for control of the outlaw's knife. Mason was stronger, but the outlaw fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, slashing wildly. Naomi tried to aim her revolver, but the men were moving too fast, too entangled for her to risk a shot. Instead, she grabbed the fallen chair and brought it down with all her strength on the outlaw's head. The wood cracked, stunning the man long enough for Mason to land a solid punch that knocked him unconscious. "Behind you!" Mason yelled, already lunging forward. Naomi whirled just as the 4th outlaw entered through the front door, his gun aimed directly at her. Time seemed to slow as she saw his finger tightening on the trigger. Then Mason was there, shoving her aside as the gun fired. She fell hard against the wall, the breath knocked from her lungs as Mason staggered back, clutching his side. Despite his wound, Mason managed to raise his revolver and fire twice in rapid succession. The outlaw jerked backward, his shot going wild before he collapsed in the doorway, unmoving. "Mason!" Naomi cried, rushing to his side as he slumped against the wall. "I'm all right," he grunted, his hand pressed to his side where blood seeped between his fingers. "Just grazed me." A quick examination confirmed his assessment. The bullet had torn through his side without hitting anything vital. Naomi quickly tore strips from the cleanest part of her borrowed shirt to bind the wound, her hands surprisingly steady despite the chaos around them. "The others?" she asked as she worked. "One's down for sure," Mason replied, grimacing as she tightened the makeshift bandage. "The other was using his horse for cover. Not sure if he's still out there." As if in answer, they heard hoofbeats retreating rapidly from the clearing. Naomi moved cautiously to the broken window, peering out to see a lone rider disappearing into the trees. "One got away," she reported, turning back to Mason. "The others are down." Mason nodded, pushing himself to his feet with a wince. "We need to secure the one that's still alive and get moving. That rider will bring back reinforcements if they have any." The unconscious outlaw was quickly bound with leather straps from Mason's saddlebags, his weapons confiscated. Outside, they found the man Mason had shot in the shoulder was still alive, moaning weakly as blood soaked the front of his shirt. "He needs a doctor," Naomi observed as they bound his hands. "He'll get one in Whitetail Creek," Mason replied, his voice hard. "Along with a jail cell. These men killed your father, Naomi. They don't deserve your compassion." Naomi looked at the wounded man, remembering her father's kind face, his dreams of their new life in Oregon. "Justice isn't the same as vengeance," she said quietly. "My father taught me that." Something in Mason's expression softened as he looked at her. "Your father raised a remarkable daughter." The compliment warmed her despite the dire circumstances. Together, they managed to get both outlaws secured on one of the abandoned horses. Mason's wound limited his mobility, but he insisted he could still ride. With Naomi once again perched in front of him on Brutus, and leading the horse carrying their prisoners, they set off toward Whitetail Creek as the sun began to set. The town appeared on the horizon just as darkness was falling, a collection of wooden buildings illuminated by oil lamps, with a church steeple rising above the other structures. Despite the lateness of the hour, their arrival caused immediate commotion, with townspeople emerging from the saloon and general store to stare at the unusual procession. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Hollister, quickly took charge of the outlaws, his deputy helping to carry the wounded man to the town doctor. "The Blackwell boys," Sheriff Hollister said, shaking his head as he examined the outlaws' faces. "Been after these two for months." "You say there were 4 altogether. 1 dead, 1 escaped," Mason confirmed, swaying slightly on his feet as the adrenaline of the fight finally began to wear off. "You need the doctor yourself, son," the sheriff observed, nodding toward Mason's blood-stained side. "The lady first," Mason insisted, gesturing to Naomi. "She nearly drowned yesterday before all this started." Naomi found herself guided to the doctor's house by the sheriff's wife, a kindly woman who clucked over her bruises and immediately set about finding her proper clothing. Mason was treated in another room, his wound cleaned and properly bandaged by the doctor. Later that evening, after both had rested and eaten a proper meal, they sat together on the porch of the boarding house, where Mrs. Hollister had arranged rooms for them. "Sheriff says he'll send a telegram to Oregon tomorrow," Mason said, his voice low in the quiet night air. "Your mother should know you're safe within the week." Naomi nodded, watching the few townspeople still moving about in the darkened street. "And what about you? Will you continue your mail route once your side heals?" Mason was silent for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that," he finally said. "The Postal Service has been talking about establishing a permanent office here in Whitetail Creek. They've offered me the position of postmaster." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Naomi said, trying to ignore the unexpected pang she felt at the thought of moving on without him. "It would mean settling down," he continued, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "No more riding alone through the wilderness. Would you miss it?" His eyes shifted to her face, something unreadable in their blue depths. "Not as much as I thought I would." The air between them seemed to change, charged with unspoken possibilities. In the short time they'd known each other, they had faced death together, fought side by side. Such experiences forged connections that couldn't be easily dismissed. "I've been thinking," Naomi said carefully, "that perhaps I should stay in Whitetail Creek for a while, at least until I can earn enough for passage to Oregon. Mrs. Hollister mentioned they need help at the school." Mason's expression brightened. "You'd stay, for a time," she said, trying to sound practical despite the fluttering in her chest whenever he looked at her that way. "It seems like a nice town, and I do have a talent for teaching." "It would be good to have a friend here," Mason said. the word friend carrying a weight that suggested he was testing waters, unsure of how she might respond. Naomi smiled, emboldened by all they had survived together. "I should hope we are more than just friends, Mr. Daniels, after all we've been through." A slow smile spread across his face, lighting his eyes in a way that made Naomi's heart skip. "Miss Richardson, are you suggesting something improper?" "Merely stating facts," she replied primly, though her cheeks warmed. "You saved my life. You were wounded protecting me. In the novels my mother forbade me to read, that would make you my hero." Mason laughed softly. "And if I wanted to court you properly?" "What would your father have said about that?" The mention of her father brought a momentary sadness, but it was tempered by the certainty that he would have approved of Mason's character. "He would have judged you by your actions, not your circumstances," she answered honestly. "And your actions speak volumes, Mason Daniels." In the weeks that followed, Naomi did indeed take a position at the small schoolhouse, quickly becoming a favorite with both the children and their parents. Mason's wound healed well, and he assumed the role of Whitetail Creek's first official postmaster, converting a small building next to the general store into a proper post office. Their courtship progressed with a proper restraint that satisfied the town's sense of propriety while deepening their connection through shared meals, walks along the creek that gave the town its name, and quiet evenings on the boarding house porch. Naomi wrote to her mother, explaining all that had happened and her decision to remain in Montana, at least for now. She didn't mention Mason directly, but something in her words must have conveyed her feelings, for her mother's reply contained gentle questions about the postal gentleman who had saved her life. As spring turned to summer, the wanted posters for the Blackwell gang were taken down, the remaining members having been captured trying to rob a bank in a neighboring town. The outlaw who had escaped from the trapper's cabin identified the dead man as Jacob Blackwell himself, the leader of the notorious gang. With his death, a reign of terror that had plagued the territory for years came to an end. On a warm evening in July, Mason took Naomi riding along the ridge overlooking the town, Brutus carrying them to a spot where wildflowers covered the hillside, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I received a letter today," Mason told her as they sat on a blanket among the flowers. "From your mother." Naomi's eyes widened in surprise. "My mother wrote to you? Whatever for?" Mason reached into his pocket, producing a small velvet pouch. "She sent this. Said it belonged to your grandmother, and that she wanted you to have it now." Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she opened the pouch, tipping its contents into her palm. A simple gold band set with a small diamond glinted in the fading sunlight. "She also said," Mason continued, his voice growing husky with emotion, "that she gives her blessing should a certain postmaster wish to make her daughter an honest proposal." Tears sprang to Naomi's eyes as Mason gently took the ring from her palm. "I never believed in fate until I saw you in that river," he said quietly. "Something made me take that route that day. Something led me to be there at exactly the right moment to catch your hand." He paused, his eyes holding hers intently. "I don't want to let go of that hand ever again, Naomi Richardson. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, her heart so full she could barely speak. "Yes, I will." As Mason slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tender kiss, Naomi knew that the currents that had nearly claimed her life had instead carried her exactly where she was meant to be, into the arms of the man who had risked everything to save her. 1 year later, on the anniversary of their meeting, Mason and Naomi Daniels stood on the banks of the Silver Fork River, now calm in its late summer flow. Their hands were clasped tightly as they looked out over the water that had brought them together. "It seems almost beautiful now," Naomi remarked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "It always was," Mason replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Even at its most dangerous, it brought me my greatest treasure." Naomi smiled, placing her free hand over the gentle swell of her stomach where their first child grew. From near tragedy had come the greatest joy either of them had known, a love born in rushing waters, tested by fire, and now flowing as steady and true as the river before them.